Language of obligation, shall. Shall imposes obligation on subject of the sentence. In other words, one of the contracting parties becomes obligated to do something. At closing, the buyer shall pay the purchase price to the seller. Compared to language of performance, the buyer hereby pays the purchase price. The obligation here is not necessarily intentionally affected immediately. Language of obligation, shall and must. Must indicates the obligation of an agent who is not made the obligor by the sentence. Sometimes this becomes a condition. The buyer shall receive the duly endorsed stock certificates from the seller, and the buyer shall wire transfer the purchase price to the seller. This is an example of misuse of shall. As the buyer is the actor agent, the buyer shall do something. Here, the buyer shall receive the stock certificates. But how could the buyer ensure it will receive the certificates? The buyer has no power to ensure the performance. It can only passively receive the certificates. Furthermore, if the buyer fails to receive the certificates, it is the buyer who has breached this clause. It is the buyer who failed to receive. This is a ridiculous proposition, but it is drafted as such. So not only would the buyer remain obligated to wire transfer the purchase price, the buyer only has itself to blame for failing its obligation to receive the stock certificates. You may argue that by context, this is unlikely to be the intention of the parties, and you may be right to believe the courts might not interpret it this way. But why would you allow the courts to have a chance to misinterpret this clause, or for a loss to be had at all on the ground of bad drafting? So it is much better to just draft it as follows. The buyer must receive the duly endorsed stock certificates from the seller, upon which the buyer shall transfer the purchase price to the seller. So here, there is no question that, as used here, must makes it a condition, not an obligation. It is not the buyer's fault for not receiving the stock certificates. Language of obligation, use of shall in plain English. In plain English, the use of will as the operative word is also generally sufficient to create a duty. In plain English, shall can be used in 1, sentences in which the subject is a first-person pronoun, I or we, and 2, in conditional clauses under the subjunctive mood. As an example of the first situation, the recipient will, or we shall, keep all information obtained confidential. Note, there is an argument that the entire contract is one agreement, so all obligations are integrated. There should be no need to separate each obligation individually by the word shall. One should just keep using will as the operative word. There is nothing wrong with this proposition. In fact, when you draft letter agreements, the use of the word shall is omitted and drafted away exactly based on this logic. As an example of the second situation, all conditions precedent shall have been completed prior to closing. The use of the words shall have been completed is in the subjunctive mode to reflect its uncertainty at the time the contract is executed. But it can also be written as language performance. The parties shall ensure all condition precedents have been fulfilled prior to closing, or as language of condition. All conditions precedents must be fulfilled prior to closing. Thank you. Please like, comment, and subscribe.